I'm trying to keep my trigger topics extremely low because who wants to get triggered all the time? But today we have to talk about one which is one of my trigger topics. And why I'm doing this video? Well, because stuff had triggered me to do it. So today I want to talk to you about server-side tracking and server-side tagging. And for everyone who immediately has the question like, well, is there even like a difference? Hell yes, there is. This is the reason why this video exists. But it not only exists to get you understand what is actually the difference between tracking and tagging, it's also to really dive deep into the whole thing to understand what it actually means from a technical side of thing. And don't be afraid. So we don't go technically that, let's say, when you're not a technical person, you don't understand, but at least like we're trying to go as deep as possible so that you have a really good understanding what it actually means. So it also helps you a little bit better to understand if it actually makes sense for you. And so these are the two things we want to go into. It's like on the one hand, understand what it means, what it does, and then on the other hand, also understand what are the use cases for it? And does it actually even make sense for me to invest some time in it? And yes, I will not say nice words about agencies who are pushing for server-side tagging. So if you are here for this, it will get to this point. All right, let's get started. There's definitely a lot of people talking about mostly server-side tagging, even when they write server-side tracking. And they are talking about it as their solution to the attribution problems. Or put it like this, there are a lot of agencies talking about this as the solution to attribution problems. But before we get into this, we have to define two branches that we have to look into. So before we can answer the questions about benefits and costs for you, mostly about benefits, so does it actually really make sense? We should really take some time to explain or to understand what server-side tracking actually means. So this is my educational offer for you. So if you're just interested in this, you just have to jump forward in the video, but I wouldn't miss this branch down here because it gives you a lot of background knowledge that helps you to make a better decision about if it really makes sense for you or not. And not just take your agency's word of, hey, we definitely need this and it will prove a lot of our attribution problems. Disclaimer, it will most likely not do that. But when you watch everything here, you will understand why not. All right, let's get started. As I said, is there actually really a difference between server-side tracking and server-side tagging? I already said it, yes, there is a difference. But before we can go into the difference, we really have to start from the beginning. So we have to talk about client and server side, because when we talk about server side, we have to know the opposite, which is client side. So when we look at the whole thing, tracking means, let's say, tracking for analytics systems, but it also means tracking for conversions that you want to send back to an advertisement platform. So this is the tracking I'm talking about. And tracking technically is pretty straightforward. So the only thing what happens is like you have a trigger, and so a trigger can be a specific page that is loading or a form has been submitted. And when this trigger becomes true, so in the end, like let's say you have a JavaScript running on your website that identifies this trigger, then an HTTP request, this is a normal request that every web browser is sending out to other pages, goes out to a platform endpoint. What is a platform endpoint? This is just another server that, for example, your analytics tool is running or your advertisement platform is running that received this request. So in the end, like it's just sending off some information to another system and telling them a specific thing. So here, most likely, a conversion has happened. Technically, not a big deal. So if you talk to the developers, they can easily send any kind of HTTP request anywhere. So it's an easy implementation to do. On a client side, it will look like this. So we have a browser or we might have an app. Doesn't really matter. So both will do the same thing. So let's say in a browser, we have a form. Let's say a form for a webinar sign up. So people come on our website using a browser and they will submit the sign up form. Then we will send an HTTP request with the information about the sign-up form, mostly just that a form has been submitted, and we will send it to an analytics or advertisement platform. So they will receive it and know now that we have a signal here that something has converted. So in case of the advertisement platform, what they can do now is they can stitch together this conversion of a form submission to a click that has happened before on an advertisement. We won't go into details how they do this all matching up. This would be a different kind of video. And let me know in the comments if you're interested and learn more about how do you actually track conversions for advertisement. So I'm happy to do another video about that. So here for us it's just important, okay, we can send out this kind of conversion event to any kind of platform and it will register it and hopefully match it up with some kind of other data. So on the server side, it doesn't look so different. So let's say someone submits this form on our website and we save this record in our database. So we have all the information about this upcoming webinar in our database. What we can do now is we can have a backend service running that recognizes, okay, look, there's a new entry in our database for this webinar, and then it does basically the same thing. So it sends out an HTTP request to the same analytics and advertisement platform. Technically, or let's say from the outside, this looks quite similar. Yes, obviously, there's something different happening. So the trigger is different. So it's not like the form submission. It's more like we save what we have with the form in our database, and then this triggers a backend service. So it's not happening in the browser. So this happens a backend service or a server-side process, and it sends off an HTTP request to an analytics or an advertisement platform. So you could also send it to an advertisement platform because they all have endpoints that you can call from one of your servers. It really looks quite similar. So what is the real difference and why are people so crazy about it? All right, so we have to compare both environments a little bit to understand this. So on the one side, we have the browser or an application, like an app on a mobile phone. And on the other side, we have a server, and there we have some backend processes. Okay, we have to talk about the concept of control next, because this explains us very nicely what is the major difference between both environments. So let's say we have the scale of control, and it can be low and it can be high. What does control actually mean? So control means is like, how much do I control the successful delivery of this HTTP request? Or how much do I control the trigger of this HTTP request? If you can recall, we had these two ingredients like trigger, HTTP request, and the endpoint we are sending it to. The question that we have to ask here is like, how much can I control these three items? And the big difference between a browser and a server-side backend process is like, in general, a browser has a very low, in a browser we have very low control over if, first of all, the trigger is captured in the right way. Second of all, if the HTTP request has been sent successfully. And then third of all, if like the endpoint can process this kind of HTTP request in the right way. So in the end, if our conversion signal actually reaches its destination. On the server side, we have high control over it. So it depends a little bit on how we design the whole system. But if we take a lot of effort and if we build a really good system, we have a very high control about if this conversion signal goes to the point where it should go to, an advertisement platform. And what's the reason for this? First of all, the browser or the app, it runs in a user's environment. So it runs on our user's computer or on their phone. It runs in their browser, so the browser that they have been picked. So we have three environments that we don't control. The browser application, which is like a third-party application, an operating system, again, third-party, and 3, the configuration that the user have put into place to work with the browser and the operating system. They can use ad blockers, or they can use any kind of other blockers. And, like to introduce a 4th one, we also don't control the network that they are currently operating on to open up our website or open up our mobile app. So there are 4 areas where we don't really have control over it, and we just have to trust them that they take their best effort to make sure that our HTTP request is going to the right place. They take some effort to do this, because if they won't, website won't really work. But on the other hand, there are browsers who prevent these kind of calls. There are ad blockers that you can add that prevent these kind of calls. This makes the whole environment very low when it comes to control. On the server side, this is quite different, because like it runs in our organization environment. So we set up this server, let's say, can connect to our application database, where, for example, with the example before, our webinar submission record is saved. So we have full control. So we can read the database, we can get a signal from the database, and we can then make sure, because it runs in our own code and our own server, we can make sure that this request is sent out. And we just say, okay, this is successfully. When we get a feedback from the endpoint, it says, oh, this was actually successfully. And then we say, great, now we can guarantee that this delivery had happened. Why? Because it's our server. So we can do whatever we want. It's also our code. We can do whatever we want there. So then, obviously, the whole thing runs in the browser and the operating system code base. So a browser is an application. It has its own code. It determines how JavaScript code gets executed when it runs within the browser. So yes, we can understand by documentation, we can understand by analyzing their code, or we can understand by doing a lot of reverse engineering. And trust me, I did a lot of reverse engineering in my career to understand how things are actually sent off. But still, there are black boxes still remaining, and so we will never fully know how this whole thing will happen. On the other hand, when we look on the server side, this runs in our code base. So it's our code. We have written it. We can test it. We have developers who understand it very deeply. So for us, it makes it pretty simple to understand how this one simple HTTP request is sent out. And then I already mentioned it, like the whole thing runs in the user's network. They might be on the phone. They might be on the go. We cannot guarantee that there's always a connection that will guarantee a successful delivery. Also because then when we send off the request, we might not get a clear signal back if it already has been sent. Maybe the users then already moved on to the next page or to the next dialogue in an application. And even when we recognize that the whole thing hasn't been sent yet, we don't have a chance to resend it back. If we go for servers, it runs in our own network, so we control it. And also, like, it's a very stable network. So user device can be there on the bus, and so they can run through spots where there's not such a good connectivity. We can assume that a server that runs in our environment, wherever it is, has a stable and always on network connection. So this is what I mean. On the server side, we have a lot of control over if we can deliver things successfully. On the browser side, we don't have that much. This is the reason why everyone who works in analytics we implement things on the client side. We always tell other people, we will never match up your numbers of your application database because we can never guarantee if stuff is actually really sent out. That's a big difference. So I hope this makes sense to you to understand, okay, browser, less control, therefore we cannot control data quality. Server side, high control, we can control data quality. Okay, so server side sounds quite promising, doesn't it? Yeah. Again, what does high control mean? It means we can guarantee the delivery. So we can guarantee a high data quality. We can guarantee the payload. This is another interesting aspect that I haven't touched based on. So when we send something from a client side, and we use third-party scripts, which most of the time we do. So we don't write the whole request ourselves. Usually we take the JavaScript code that we get from a vendor. This is usually, I would say, at least if it's a vendor that is quite big, would be more a safe thing. But it could also be like we just get it from our agency. And they have wrapped let's say, the code that usually is sent to the advertisement platform with something on their own. When we put it on our website, we cannot fully guarantee what this stuff is actually sending off unless we do a lot of analysis, which I usually try to recommend, but it's rarely done because we don't have time, we don't have the resources. What can happen is that the script that you run on your client side enriches the whole data that you actually are intending to send. So you just want to send the form submission, but it might enrich other data. So it might pull in browser information and pull in the screen size. It pulls in other information that it can get about the environment. So maybe it scrapes what you have on your website. So you cannot really guarantee what kind of payload is sent off unless you really analyze and then go back to your agency and say, look, fine, I want to track my form submission conversion, but I don't want to send this whole, let's say, environment information with that. So when you do things with high controls on the server side, you have control about what kind of payload is sent off, because there this whole approach with, let's say, integrating some custom script that reads out the environment doesn't work, because it cannot read out the environment. Even when you use third-party SDKs on the server side, they can just read, or they can just use what you provide to them. So they don't have a possibility to read out other things, or the things that they can read out are actually not really useful, so they won't use it. So this is, for example, a very compelling argument for me. Besides all this, oh, you get more data and so on, I can actually make sure that I don't send off data that I actually don't want to send off. This is the whole compliance and privacy topic, where I think server-side is often not really, let's say, where something people often overlook what potential, let's say, improvement server-side can give you. And the other thing is like the guaranteed destination. So this sounds a little bit weird, because like you would say, okay, I just took my tracking script on my client side and the agency told me this is like for sending the conversions to Meta or to Google Ads, but you don't know. Technically, I can write a script that looks from the outside that it's just sending the data to one kind of destination. But I can write it in a way that it actually sends it to 20 different kind of destinations. And only when you analyze it very thoroughly how these all requests are going out and going somewhere else, you can recognize, okay, where do the requests actually go? If I do the whole thing on the server side, I can really make sure that I just want to send it to this one destination and not somewhere else. So again, this is what high control means. And even when this sounds a little bit weird and creepy, this happens much more than you think. So if you just right now have some tracking script on your browser, let's say on your client side, and you are not so much sure about where the data is coming to, so there are some tools that you can Google and can check, okay, where your data is actually sent from the client side. So again, when I have the control, I can make sure that I just send the data to this one destination and not somewhere else. So this is cool. Look, with server side, we get this high control, so we can make sure all these three things, which is a really good thing. So again, I would say sign me up for this whole thing, and I think you say the same thing, because most of the people immediately think, okay, server side means Google Server-Side Tag Manager. And this is a little bit of this confusion that is out there, that when someone is writing, and I see many people who write server-side tracking and actually mean server-side tagging. So we have to dig a little bit deeper. So Google Server-Side Tag Manager seems to be like a Go thing. Well, maybe not. So here we are. So this is my trigger moment. So therefore, it's very important for me to talk about it. So maybe it helps me to get over this. So first of all, we have to answer the question, is server-side Google Tag Manager? And so just to be fair, there are other server-side tagging systems. There's not just Google Server-Side Tag Manager that you can use. So there are others as well. So Gentis, for example, is a service that you can use and has nothing to do with Google Server-Side Tag Manager. But let's keep server-side Google Tag Manager because it's the most used system by far, and compare it to server-side tracking. So are server-side tagging and server-side tracking the same thing? Let's have a quick look back what we just looked at before. So on the server side, so you know this already. Okay, this server-side process, record saved, it happens on the server-side backend process. HTTP request goes out to advertisement platform. Let's look into server-side tag manager. So again, we have a trigger and a tag. So the trigger and tag. So there goes a trigger into the server-side tag manager, and then there's a tag that is executing this kind of request out. Looks not so different than, let's say we have a record saved. Yeah, something triggers it, and then something happens. And then again, we have a server backend process. If we just deploy it, let's say in the standard way, in the Google server-side tag manager case, it will run somewhere in Google Cloud. Obviously, there's a possibility to run it on different kind of clouds and so on, but it runs on some kind of server. So again, looks pretty similar. Server-side backend process, server-side backend process. If you don't do something, it happens to be in Google Cloud, but you can run it also like in AWS. HTTP request goes out to an analytics and advertisement platform. So this looks very similar, doesn't it? So here is what makes it slightly different. The trigger comes from a browser, at least in most of the cases. So technically, I can send an HTTP request to the server tag manager, and then the server tag manager does something with it. But the trigger has to come from an external system. So it's not like my internal system directly connected to my server tag manager. So this is something that is not possible. I mean, there are edge cases, but still, I always have to send a external request to the server-side tag manager to trigger something. And so in most of the cases, I would say 98% of the cases of server-side tag management implementation, this trigger comes from a browser. So browser means client side. So in the end, technically we have moved away from the client, but one part of our equation, as I said before, we have a trigger, we have an HTTP request, we have an endpoint. One part of these three elementary elements is still coming from the browser or the client, and this is the trigger. So the trigger gets triggered on the client side. It's then passed down to the server-side tag manager, and from there we send the request to an analytics and ad platform. So in the end, let's say, to say it in very simple terms, maybe some people might not be happy with this definition, but let's say technically our server tag manager is a kind of a proxy that sits between the client side and the advertisement platform. It just proxies requests through. So let's say a request from a client side, instead going directly to the analytics platform, is sent first here and then sent there. Okay, why do you actually do this? Or why do you use a proxy? This is a selling point of agencies. One point to use a proxy is because you can give it a different name. So you can run your proxy under your domain. So for example, like my domain is timodechau.com, I could run my server-side tag manager under, let's say, data.timodechau.com, and it looks like I'm sending the data to my own server backend, but technically it's not so untrue. So like Google, let's say the server tag manager runs on one server that I have access to, that I potentially also own. So it sends it there, but then it sends it off to an advertisement platform. So I'm proxying my server. Let's say I don't send my request directly to an advertisement platform. I run it through a proxy that I control and own. Again, this is good. We have control over this proxy to some extent, and I will get into where we don't have the control in a second. But this is something important to understand when we go back to the server-side thing. When we use our record saved in our database as a trigger, this all happens in all our systems. So we don't actually need any kind of trigger from a client side to run a server-side process. So we can be totally disconnected from the whole thing. So we don't have to receive a client-side signal. And obviously something has to happen in our backend services where we can say, okay, this is actually a trigger. So if this entry is never saved in a database, obviously we would not send anything. But on the other hand, this is totally fine because it looks like the form never really made it down to our database. So why should we send something? This is an isolated system. So this all runs completely on the server side. It doesn't need an active client side or external request to our server side to do things. So this whole thing can run completely independently. A server-side tag manager needs this external trigger to run. So let's have a quick look at our control panel. We had this before. We had the 3 categories where we say, okay, we have to test our level of control on it. And here we will see that server-side tag, Google, in this case, we're talking about server-side Google Tag Manager. So we can see how does it compare to server-side tracking. You can remember server-side tracking, everything was green. So here, let's look at the first one, runs in our organization environment. That is actually true. So we can deploy server-side Google Tag Manager in our environment where we want. So we can run it in our Google Cloud environment. So this is the standard setting, but we can also take it and run it everywhere else where we own, let's say, a server instance, be it virtual or be it physical. So yes, that is true. So this gives us more control about things. Let's go to the other one. It runs on our organization network. Again, the same, because the server runs, let's say, in our cloud instance or on physical servers, we also have control over the network. So great, check. Hi. Then we come to the point, which is usually my point, why I'm not the biggest fan of a server-side Google Tag Manager. It runs on our organization's code base. No, it actually does not. The server-side Google Tag Manager is a code that Google provides to us, and they are happy to share it with us, and we can run it in our, let's say, on our server. But it's their code base. We don't have control over this code base, and we cannot even look fully into the code base. So this gives us not so much control over the code base. Even if we would know the code, so even if we would have full insight into the code and we understand how things are running, we still cannot control it, because it creates a sandbox environment where it allows us to do specific things, but it's not a completely controllable code base. And you could say, yeah, what's the big problem with that? There are enough scenarios where it's definitely not a big problem, but for me, this is like a major difference to, let's say, run things in our code base. Because, for example, in our own code base, I can develop a system that guarantees a full delivery of a conversion. I can build this kind of system in my own code base. I can try to build something like this in a server-side Google Tag Manager, but it's much harder to do, and it will never be, let's say, on the same level if I would do it in my own code base. So here is a significant difference between them. So we can already say server-side tagging and server-side tracking, at least when I use server-side Google Tag Manager, is not the same thing. So here's one thing to say. So I used own-coded server-side tagging to some degree. So I created some system that worked quite similarly, like the server-side Google Tag Manager are working. This is a different thing. So in that case, I would have the full control over the code base because it's my own code. In the end, it behaves still in the same way that we have here, I need a trigger from the outside to run then. So it's still not completely like server-side tracking, but at least it gives me one of the things that I don't get when I have server-side Google Tag Manager. All right, so I hope this all makes sense. If not, let me know in the comments. So here comes my opinion about server-side tag management, especially when it's the Google server-side tag manager. It's server-side tracking light, and you have to know it and you have to treat it like this. So you don't get the full benefits of server-side tracking with server-side tagging. You get some of the benefits, but you don't get all of them. And so this is something we will look into next. Because maybe you already asked yourself the question, because you get pushed by other parties to say, hey, we definitely have to go for server-side tagging. Interestingly, not so many people push for server-side tracking. And also here, maybe as a quick history note, server-side tracking is something which is around, I would say, 10, 12 years. So I did server-side tracking implementation already, maybe really 8 or 9 years ago. So systems like Segment, systems like Amplitude, systems like Mixpanel, they allowed server-side tracking already pretty early on when they came out, because they had SDKs for it, they had endpoints for it that we can use. And so I did this stuff already years before server-side even came along. Server-side tracking was still a niche thing because like most companies were not really set up to do these things. For them, it was much easier to do it client-side. So therefore, it was not like the common approach. But when I was doing these kind of projects, I was always trying to see if we have possibilities to do it on the server side, because we will get to the benefits now in a second. But you already know, like we have high control over everything. So let's have a look. Is server-side tracking or tagging actually worth the effort? So let's have a first look on server-side tracking. As I said, it's already around for a much longer time. I already used it a lot, so therefore I know if it makes sense or not. And so here's my breakdown if server-side tracking really makes sense. So first of all, because it comes with specific constraints, and it's important to know about these constraints. So if you answer no to one of the questions, then definitely server-side tracking might not be the solution for you. So first of all, you have to have backend development resources that can implement it. This is not a guaranteed scenario. Sometimes backend services are not really included or are sitting very far away. Sometimes like client side and server side are completely two different kind of organizations. I worked in these kind of projects. So I was working with the client side organization, and if they would have to ask something from the server side organization, it would take ages to do. In this kind of case, server side tracking doesn't even make real sense because you don't really have access to the resources. So you have to have access to the resources. It also might be that you have 4 client side developers and just 1 backend developer. So you can technically ask them, or ask this person if he or she can implement something, but she will have a lot of other stuff to do, and so there might not be a lot of resources to do things. You have more people on the client, so therefore you might better ask on the client side to do things. So this is requirement number 1. And then obviously your code base that you run on the backend should be capable of, let's say, to find all the different kind of triggers that you can send the stuff out. Usually it has to be like this. Whatever you do, something has to end up in your database to be saved so that people, when they log in, they see the same stuff again. But there are definitely rare examples where just things happening on the client side and nothing of this is written to any kind of backend. If you have this scenario, then it's really hard for you to do things on the server side because the triggers or the signals to start a process on the server side to send something off don't really end up on the server. Then obviously this doesn't really work that you can send it. You have to have an application database where a lot of stuff is saved. Then you have usually the code base to handle things on the server side. Then a very important point, sometimes missed, do the destinations where you want to send the data to, do they actually have proper endpoints? And this is an important thing. So I give you one example. Google Analytics 4 has a proper API endpoint where you can send data technically from a server side. But honestly, like it's the measurement protocol API. But working with this is not really nice and it has some limitations. If you work, for example, with an Amplitude API, you have much more possibilities. For example, one thing, like a big major difference is in an Amplitude API, I can send historic event. Historic means I can send an event from last week. So maybe like we have some qualifications event running on our server side where we fix things, clean up things, or for example, we wait until someone has finally paid before we want to send this off. But it happens some days later. The Google Analytics API doesn't allow that. Please correct me if this has changed, but the last time I checked, I think you had a restricted time window of some days. So the old API was even worse. I think there you could go back 4 hours. Now I think you can go back 36 hours. Check it again in the documentation. So I haven't done it for a while. But for example, you could not go back a week. At least these were some scenarios that I was trying, or even going back further. Check the APIs if it's even possible. There are a lot of advertisement networks that don't have a API that you can call from a server side because they don't have the credentials, they don't have the things in place. So they only work from a client side. always get a little bit suspicious when this is happening, because it might also be that they rely on a lot of environment variables that they just read out with their tracking script from the client to send back. Might be or might be not. Okay, so if all this is true, you can go for it. Then you can really use server-side tracking, and I would always recommend to do, as I said, your data quality can improve significantly. And beyond that, there might be other benefits. Like one benefit that I haven't mentioned so far of server-side tracking is if you run the same application on different kind of clients. So let's say in a browser, mobile apps, so you might have an Apple one, an Android one, or maybe then you're even so crazy that it runs, for example, on TVs as well or somewhere else. In that case, if you could move things to the server side and you understand which kind of things are triggered by the mobile apps or which kind are triggered by the web service, which usually like your application knows, then you just have to implement your tracking once and it already works for all the different kind of clients because you have it in the one central place where everything goes together. Again, comes a little bit down to what kind of architecture you're using. But again, I would highly recommend to go into server-side tracking because your data quality will improve significantly. Okay, let's move on to server-side tagging. Okay, can you manage the setup or do you have a managed service for server-side Google Tag Manager? Again, when we're talking about server-side tagging, I will talk about server-side Google Tag Manager here because most of the people use it. So the first question is an important one. If you are intending to deploy the server-side Google Tag Manager yourself, which is quite straightforward, you have to go just into the Google Tag Manager. There's even a button where you can say, okay, please deploy it for me. Google makes you think that this is all cool. And I would say in 98% of the cases, this is all cool when you just click this one button and deploy it for me. But you have to make sure you deploy it, let's say, on a server where the management is limited. So I still think the standard one of Google when they deploy it is still that they run an App Engine service, which is a managed service within the Google Cloud. So Google takes care of a lot of things, but they don't take care of anything. For example, your traffic is increasing significantly and very rapidly, then it might be that your App Engine cannot really handle the whole thing. And we are talking about an essential piece of your tracking setup now. So let's say your server-side GTM server cannot handle all the requests now coming from the client anymore. You will lose events. And the nasty thing about tracking is like when you lose things along the way, they are lost. They don't come back ever again. You have to make sure that you think about how you want to manage a server-side tag management setup. My recommendation when I talk with, let's say, companies who want to do this is like to go with one of the managed ones. So I worked a lot with Stape in the past and they have a really good service and I can highly recommend to use them. Don't do a managed server-side tag management setup when you don't really know what you do. If you have a DevOps team and they manage a lot of servers, like all the different servers that you have for your application, and you can go to them and say, look, I want to run this here, this Google thing. Can you take care of it? And they say, sure, we can. That's the same thing. These are people who do this, the daily job, to keep servers up and running. So for them, it's fine. They can put it in their whole setup. They will put the same monitoring on top. So they will have a close eye on if they will build the infrastructure in a way that it can scale with all these things. But this has to be in place. If you cannot do it, go for managed service. So then you have to ask yourself, is it fine for you to depend on one vendor solution? This is a whole topic when we talk about Google products in general. If you know me and like my things, that I'm not the biggest fan of the whole Google infrastructure, especially the analytics one, because like it makes you dependent on one thing, which a vendor is maintaining for you, and this vendor doesn't even have a pricing model behind it. So yeah, you get server-side Google Tag Manager instance, the code, for free. So what is Google's business model? That's a video of its own, but in the end, like you're depending on them that they continue to maintain it to some degree. When they would stop maintaining it, it would still run fine for at least, I don't know, quite a while. But at some point, things might change and you have an unmaintained code thing sitting there in the middle where all your conversion events are going through. So this is something where you have to say, okay, is it actually for me? Is this risk fine for me? And I would say in most of the cases it is, because when it comes to analytics events, what happens? So then you maybe are missing some analytics events. Most of the companies don't do that many things with the analytics events. So if they're 10% missing, let's be all honest, it doesn't really change. On the other hand, when we're talking about, let's say, conversion events sending back to advertisement platforms, and let's say you have a solid business that is driving 70% by ad-induced traffic, and if you lose 5% of this because of some problems, your advertisement might still work. But if this is getting worse, then your advertisement might become very inefficient, and then you start to pay more money for the new leads or new customers you're getting in, and your whole business model is starting to shift. So the question here is, let's say, how risky is this whole thing to track proper conversions? And again, I don't see the risk very high here, because Google is a very established vendor. They will be around and maybe pretty likely in the next 10 years. But still, if people are serious about their setup, I would always take the sign off of every parties involved to say, okay, we are happy with going with this one vendor solution where we don't really have an alternative for it. So then you can answer the question, do I just want to proxy client events? So this means I don't want to do crazy stuff in the server-side tag manager. So for me, it's more like I want to make sure that all the thing is not sent directly to, let's say, to Google Ads and so on, because I just want to have it run through my servers. Also like that it doesn't send IP addresses of my users directly to these other servers. So it all goes through me. And so I just want to proxy stuff. Then you don't really make your setup more complicated. So therefore I would say, okay, sure, go ahead. So then you can, okay, we have to talk a little bit about this. So you want just to have a shady way to ignore consent. And this is just an inner question for yourself. So you don't have to tell me. But I have to tell you is, obviously, consent is also important. And by the way, also for server-side tracking. So server-side tracking doesn't take away the consent that you have to ask. So in server-side tracking setup that I usually do, we have the consent in the database, and then we use this consent in the database to decide if we can send this server-side tracking event, or in which form we send off the server-side tracking event to wherever we want to send it. So do we send it with personal information? Yes or no? The same thing applies there. And here's the same. So if your agency is pushing you, we just need to have more conversions. So we can just send it on the server side. No one sees if we send the stuff off then to Meta Conversion API. I would definitely recommend to stop here if this is your intention why you want to use server-side tag manager, and then talk to your legal people and have a serious conversation about it. So I won't go into more full details here. Obviously, one of the reasons why people go for server-side, because no one from the outside can now see which kind of data they are sending off. So it looks like they can send off more, but this stuff can get you into trouble still, because someone can come around and say, we would like to audit your whole setup here, and we would like to have a look in what kind of stuff you're sending off in a server-side tag management situation. And then obviously you will see it. Okay, so you don't want to ignore consent, so you still say, okay, you want to make sure that you, let's say, just send data when you have the consent for it. So do you want to make sure what data you want to send and to where? So if you say yes to this is really like a very good argument for server-side Google Tag Manager, because as I explained before, I cannot have any kind of shady JavaScript that is sending my stuff to other destinations as well. If I have things on the server side, I send it to just one destination. So I can really make sure what kind of data I want to send to which kind of destination. This is, by the way, my usual argument to use server-side tag manager. So when people come to me and say, hey, we want to have server-side tag manager, I say, okay, what is your goal? And they say, yeah, we want to have more data for attribution. I usually say, maybe it's not worth the effort to do, because you don't get so much more data for attribution. It usually doesn't really make a big difference. And so I'm still waiting for the people to prove me a different point. But if you say, hey, we want to use server-side tag manager solution because we cannot really do server-side tracking, and this seems for us like the way in the middle, and the reason why we do it, like we really want to make sure what kind of data we are sending out, I would always say, yeah, go for it. That is a really good solution to do this because it gives you a lot of control. So you can filter out specific kind of values before you send them off. That is not really possible on the client side. So it gives you a lot more control. We showed this before. So this is definitely a reason why I would say, okay, the server side and even Google Tag Manager is a good solution for you. If you want to use this, and this again comes back to this attribution thing, if you want to use it to play catch and hide with HTTP set cookies, this will be an argument that a lot of agency will come around, or maybe they don't even tell you, but actually this is what this whole thing is about. What they want to use server-side tag manager for is to avoid these cookie deletion rules that, for example, Safari is applying to you. I wrote play catch and hide for a reason. I saw these setups where people really spend this time optimizing these things to get maybe 7 days more out of it. I'm never really sure if this is worth the effort. So yes, it works. So yeah, you can set up things and you can be sure that when Apple introduces new constraints every year when they release a new macOS or a new iOS version, there will be some people sitting down, oh, actually, I can do this thing now in my tag manager, or I have this now new tool that can do this thing and that can work around this kind of restriction. I'm not really sure if it's worth the money and effort because, again, I could create a whole video about what 5% more conversion data makes the difference for your attribution game because you only catch 50% of your click-based attribution anyway. But again, like if you follow me, you know that I created already a lot of content around this, why click-based attribution is very limited. And when you already are in a limited environment, to get 5% more of a limited data set, it doesn't really make such a big difference. So if you are in this game, if you just want to prove you do something for it, then maybe this might be worth doing it. If you really hope it makes a difference, I'm not so sure if this is the right reason. And then let's say finally, if you just want to use server-side tag manager because your agency told you that you have to use Meta conversion API, yeah. Does it make a difference? It might make a difference, but here's the important thing. You can use Meta's conversion API also just from your server side. I don't really understand why it became so popular with server-side tag manager. I think maybe because the agencies that were more pushing for it. I built a lot of offline conversion setups already where we just sending the conversion data from the server side back to Meta or to Google. And yes, it improves data quality significantly. Again, it comes down to consent again, so you cannot just randomly take all the personal data that you have collected about all your customers and send it off to Facebook. So you still have to make sure that these people gave consent to it. But yeah, you might have a possibility to control more the data of people that gave consent to you. Let's say to control what kind of, so you might have more fallbacks that you can send off to the advertisement platforms, and by then you can send some more data. But again, it might not make such a big difference along that. To just use Meta conversion API, you can do it wherever you want. So you don't need to have server-side tag manager. Server-side tag manager is a possibility, but if I have the possibility, I might go for server-side tracking because again, I control the code base. I can control how I enrich the data before I send it off to Meta. And I don't have to do this weird thing in a black box that I don't really own, which is the server-side Google Tag Manager. All right. Let's quickly wrap it up. What you should take away. So first of all, the first takeaway is server-side tagging is not server-side tracking. I hope you know that it's a close one. So server-side tagging, as I said, is server-side tracking light. The reason why it's just light is because it needs this trigger usually from a third party, which most times is the browser. So it still needs this one trigger. So it's not an isolated process like server-side tracking usually is. And when this trigger is blocked or goes away, it doesn't really work. And the second thing is when you use server-side tagging with Google Tag Manager, you don't own the code base. So you cannot put the same measures in place like you could do on a server-side tracking setup. Server-side tracking gives you the maximum control over data quality. So if data quality is something really important for you, server-side tracking is the way to go. Server-side tagging gives you more control over data quality than client-side tracking. That is definitely, but it's less than server-side tracking. So you have to be aware of that. So if data quality is really like your goal, figure out if you can do server-side tracking. Server-side Tag Manager, by this, is a lightweight alternative if your development team cannot really do server-side tracking. And yeah, I think this is definitely, there are enough scenarios where this is true. So even when I'm a server-side tracking fan, I still did some setups where we were using server-side tagging because there was no way to implement server-side tracking. And a quick reminder, server-side also needs consent. However you handle consent, however your terms are looking like, when you send stuff off, when you send personal data off to another system, you need to have some kind of consent, however this looks like. All right, so I hope this was helpful. You are now over 50 minutes into this whole thing. So I hope that you had some takeaways that help you to make better decisions about server-side. And also I hope you just understand that server-side tagging is actually not server-side tracking. And I think for me, the biggest takeaway is like, when an agency is approaching you and saying you, hey, you're not happy with the tracking, you're not happy here, campaign performance not so good, yeah, that's a tracking issue that we have here, but we should definitely do server-side tagging to improve it. The improvements of using server-side tagging, especially on attributions, are not that big. So if they are charging you a significant amount to implement server-side tagging, it might not be worth doing it. So ask them very critical questions, what they think which will improve. Can they show it how it will improve? There are good agencies around there who make it very transparent what they think, what makes it improve. Pick these ones over the ones who say, yeah, wait, it's just better for attribution. So, okay, with that, if you have any kind of questions, leave them in the comment. If you like these kind of videos, make sure you subscribe to the channel and see you in the next long explainer video.